Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Paul Dano in Prisoners. On the surface, it starts like a typical kidnapping case, but very quickly the film shifts into something far more psychological. Because the real tension isn't about finding two missing girls, it's about what happens inside a human mind when uncertainty becomes unbearable, and how far someone is willing to go when time stops feeling like an ally and starts feeling like an enemy. Keller Dover, Hugh Jackman, and Franklin Birch, Terrence Howard. Two fathers, two families, a normal Thanksgiving day. But normality in Prisoners is never stable. It's just the moment before everything collapses. Keller, in particular, carries a mindset that feels almost invisible at first. He doesn't just love his children, he prepares for their absence in advance. Not because he expects tragedy, but because he is already afraid of what he would do if it ever arrived. That thought lives quietly in him long before anything happens. Anna and Joy, the two young girls, disappear, and the shift is immediate. But not just in events, in perception. For Keller, reality doesn't simply change, it fractures. Time stops being something that moves forward and becomes something that is actively taken away from him. Every passing second feels like a negotiation he is losing. And in that mental space, logic becomes secondary, emotion becomes dominant. But not calm emotion, something heavier, a mixture of fear, guilt, and responsibility, all collapsing into one feeling: urgency. Detective Loki, Jake Gyllenhaal, enters the case, and he exists in complete contrast to Keller. Where Keller expands emotionally, Loki compresses everything. He reduces chaos into structure, information into patterns, people into variables. Not because he is cold, but because that is the only way he can survive exposure to this kind of suffering. If he allows himself to fully feel what he sees, he knows he will lose control of the investigation. So he builds distance. And that distance becomes his strength, but also his limitation. Very early in the investigation, suspicion falls on Alex Jones, Paul Dano, a young man already marked by instability, by awkwardness, by social disconnection. And the film quietly shows something important here: how quickly human judgment attaches meaning to someone who looks wrong. Once that attachment happens, evidence starts bending around perception. People stop asking, "What is true?" and start asking, "What fits?" Keller watches this process unfold, and internally, something begins to fracture further. Because the system he believed in, police, investigation, law, does not move at the speed his fear demands. And fear, once it reaches a certain level, doesn't care about structure anymore. It only cares about outcome. So when Alex is arrested but no confession holds and no proof arrives, Keller experiences something deeper than frustration. He experiences disbelief in the system itself. Not ideological disbelief, emotional disbelief. The feeling that the world is simply not responding correctly to the situation. That is the moment he kidnaps Alex. But psychologically, that act is not just violence, it is replacement. Keller replaces uncertainty with control, because uncertainty is what he cannot tolerate. In his mind, leaving things unanswered is more dangerous than forcing a wrong answer. And once Alex is in the basement, the dynamic becomes something darker than interrogation. It becomes projection. Keller is no longer only trying to extract information. He is trying to externalize his internal panic. Every question he asks Alex is actually aimed at reducing his own emotional collapse. But Alex does not provide resolution. He remains ambiguous. And that ambiguity becomes the real torture. For Keller, not just for Alex. Because ambiguity prevents closure. And without closure, grief cannot stabilize. Detective Loki, meanwhile, continues moving through layers of evidence. But each layer he uncovers doesn't simplify the case. It multiplies it. Additional suspects, symbolic details, contradictions that don't align cleanly. And slowly, even Loki's structured mind begins to absorb pressure. Not emotional breakdown, but cognitive overload. The kind that comes when logic keeps expanding without ever resolving. What makes Prisoners psychologically intense is that every character is trying to stabilize reality in a different way. Keller tries to stabilize it through force. Loki tries to stabilize it through logic. But reality itself refuses stabilization. It keeps shifting, refusing to settle into something explainable. And Alex becomes the center of all of it. Not as a character with agency in the traditional sense, but as a point where other people's fears converge. He is interpreted more than he is understood, and that interpretation changes depending on who is looking at him. To Keller, he is potential truth. To Loki, he is potential suspect. To the audience, he is uncertainty embodied. As time progresses, Keller's psychology continues to shift in subtle but irreversible ways. He begins to rationalize actions that earlier versions of himself would reject. But importantly, he doesn't feel like he is changing into something else. He feels like he is finally doing what needs to be done. That is the key transformation. Morality doesn't disappear. It gets rewritten in real time to match desperation. Loki, on the other hand, becomes more aware of how fragile certainty actually is. He sees how easily narratives form around incomplete evidence, and he understands that truth in this case is not just hidden, it is layered under human interpretation. Every step toward truth also passes through someone's bias, someone's fear, someone's need. And as both Keller and Loki continue, the distance between them narrows in one specific way. They are both losing trust in the systems they rely on, just in different directions. Keller loses trust in law. Loki loses trust in simplicity. The deeper message of Prisoners starts to form here. It is not about crime. It is about what happens when human beings are placed in a situation where time feels insufficient for morality to function properly. Because morality requires reflection, and reflection requires time. But panic removes time from the equation. And in that removal, people don't become monsters instantly. They become logical to themselves, which is far more unsettling. By the end, what remains is not just the question of what happened to the girls, but how many internal lines were crossed in the attempt to answer it, and whether those lines, once crossed, can ever truly be restored. Because the real prison in Prisoners is not where anyone is held. It is the psychological space where certainty becomes more important than humanity.